December 1906, Chicago, Illinois, and the air over Packingtown tastes like iron and rendered fat. It is not a smell you get used to. It coats your coat, your hair, the inside of your mouth, and it follows you home on the streetcar and sits beside you at dinner and refuses to leave. The cold is specific here. Not the clean cold of open country, but the wet, heavy cold of a city built on marsh, a cold that settles against your skin and will not let go. The gas lamps along Exchange Avenue are still burning when the first shift arrives. Before sunrise, workers in rubber aprons stream through iron gates in the dark, their breath fogging in white clouds, their boots pulling free of frozen mud with a sound like something tearing. They carry their knives in leather rolls under their arms. They do not speak. Inside, a single steer enters a kill floor chute. The animal does not make a sound. 38 seconds later, it has become 22 labeled crates. A telegraph ticker in a New York office spits out a price before the blood has cooled on the drain channel. Someone in London eats the result by Thursday. At its peak, this 1 square mile of Chicago's South Side fed 1/3 of the United States. It ran on precision, ice, and controlled brutality, and it made a handful of men into the most powerful unelected figures in the country. They were not politicians, they were not generals, they were butchers, and they built the closest thing to a food empire that industrial civilization had ever produced. But to understand how this ended, you have to go back to 1865 and to 9 railroad companies who decided that Chicago would be the throat of the nation. The year is 1865, the Civil War has just ended, and the American cattle trade is a mess of competing interests, overlapping rail lines and scattered stockyards spread across the south side of Chicago like a fever that can't find its center. 9 rival railroad companies, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy, the Chicago and Alton, and 6 others. Each control a segment of the cattle-to-city pipeline, and each charges what it wants, routes how it wants, and loses animals in transit with a frequency that would embarrass a more accountable industry. They hate each other, they undercut each other, they build redundant infrastructure within blocks of each other because no one will yield first. The result is chaos at scale, and the cattle ranchers of Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska, who are trying to rebuild after the war, are paying for all of it in spoilage and delay and arbitrary fees. The solution, proposed and organized by a financier and land speculator named John Sherman, not the general, the other one, is brutal in its elegance. Build 1 neutral yard, owned by all 9 railroads jointly, where no single company controls the pricing, where the animals move efficiently between lines, where buyers and sellers can meet on ground that belongs to everyone and therefore to no one. In June 1865, a 320-acre swamp on the south side is purchased for $100,000. The incorporation charter for the Union Stockyard and Transit Company is filed on December 25, 1865, Christmas Day, either an accident of legal scheduling or a joke that history has not clarified. By January 1866, the pens are open. The iron rail enclosures are each 16 feet wide, designed to hold exactly 100 head, with wood plank walkways elevated above so buyers can inspect the animals without wading through what the animals leave behind. 9 railroads pull into the same yard for the first time. The cattle flow in from 6 directions simultaneously. The men who built it to end competition had, without meaning to, built the engine of it, because the competition they were really about to unleash had nothing to do with railroads. It had everything to do with what happened to the animal once it arrived. And to understand that, you have to understand what came before Chicago and why it failed. Through the 1840s and 1850s, the undisputed capital of American meatpacking is Cincinnati, Ohio, a city so deep in hog slaughter that visitors describe the smell as a living presence, a thing with weight and direction. They call it Porkopolis, and it earns the name. But Cincinnati has a problem it cannot engineer around. The Ohio River, its primary shipping artery, freezes for roughly 4 months every winter, and when the river stops, so does everything else. Hog barrels stack up on the docks. Buyers in the east wait. Prices spike, then collapse when the thaw comes and everything moves at once. The flatboats that carry the barrels south are a technology of patience and wood, not speed, and patience is not what an industrializing nation wants from its food supply. The system is seasonal by nature, and seasonal means fragile, and fragile means that anyone who can offer year-round supply will eat Cincinnati's lunch. Chicago can. Lake Michigan produces ice in industrial quantities. The new rail lines do not freeze. The geography of the Great Lakes Basin, combined with the convergence of rail lines from the plains, gives Chicago a cold chain advantage that Cincinnati's best lawyers cannot argue away and its best engineers cannot replicate. Capital migrates north. Packers follow the capital. Early Chicago meat dealers like Gurdon Hubbard, who had been moving cattle and pork through the city since the 1820s, watched the scale change beneath them, watched the seasonal rhythm they understood get replaced by something that never stops. They were trying to preserve an older world, local, seasonal, barrel and flatboat, predictable. Instead, their migration planted the seed of something they did not recognize until it was too late. Running from the river, they ran straight into the machine. The machine had two engineers, and their names were Philip Danforth Armour and Gustavus Swift. Armour opens his Chicago plant in 1867. Swift arrives in Chicago in 1875 at the age of 36, already a successful cattle dealer from New England, already impatient with the way things are done. The way things are done in 1875 is this. You buy a live steer in Chicago, you load it onto a rail car, you ship it alive to New York or Boston, you slaughter it there. Live animals lose weight in transit. They panic. They injure each other. They require feed and water for multi-day journeys. The railroads love this system because live animal cars are heavy and the freight rates are high. Swift watches the math and sees a different equation. Slaughter the animal in Chicago, where the labor is cheap and the infrastructure already exists, ship the chilled carcass east, and deliver it at 30% lower cost than the live animal competition. The railroads refuse to carry his refrigerator cars. He is cutting into their freight revenue, and they know it. Swift finances his own fleet of refrigerated rail cars, insulated wooden boxes packed with ice harvested from the Great Lakes, and contracts with independent rail lines to carry them. Eastern meat markets, cautious at first, begin signing on when they see the price. Within 4 years, the major railroads capitulate and begin offering refrigerated freight themselves because they have no choice. Swift files a patent on his refrigerated car design in 1878. The patent is the legal marker, but the real document is the trolley hook. Overhead iron rails carry the carcasses down the kill floor past stationary workers, each man performing one cut, one specific cut, the same cut 10,000 times a week. Hide off, head removed, organs extracted, fat trimmed, everything routed, nothing escapes, nothing wasted. The tallow goes to soap and candles, the blood goes to fertilizer. The bones go to glue and buttons, the bristles go to brushes, the intestines go to sausage casings. Armour's accountants eventually calculate byproduct revenue streams that generate profit from materials that competing operations throw away. The click of the trolley hook on the iron rail is not merely a mechanical sound, it is the sound of an entire continent reorganizing itself around a new logic of production. By 1880, the Union stockyards are no longer a yard. They are an organism, 475 acres, 13,000 pens, 50 miles of internal rail. The air inside the perimeter has its own climate. Warm from the bodies of millions of animals, thick with ammonia and blood, the floors never fully dry, the drain channels running constantly, the noise a layered thing of hooves on wood and chain rattle, and the low continuous sound of animals that sense what is coming. The stone gate entrance arch, built in 1879 from limestone, carries 2 carved cattle heads above the arch and stands at the entrance to Exchange Avenue like the entrance to a sovereign state, which in practical terms it almost is. Inside the perimeter there is a bank, a hotel called the Transit House, a telegraph office, and enough saloons to staff a small city. By 1890, the yards processes 10 million animals per year. The Census Bureau, tallying the labor force in Chicago's meatpacking sector that year, records an employment figure so large that it effectively means the yards is not adjacent to a neighborhood. It is the neighborhood. The streets of Packingtown fill with the workers who cannot afford to live anywhere else, who shop at company stores inside the perimeter, who drink at bars that stay open because the kill floor runs around the clock and somebody is always finishing a shift. The organism breathes in cattle from the plains and breathes out product eastward, and every system inside it, the pens, the kill floors, the cooling rooms, the loading docks, functions as an organ with a specific role. And when any organ slows, the whole body registers the disruption immediately. Commission agents, the men who broker the livestock sales inside the yards, develop their own specialized language, their own hierarchy, their own claims on particular pens and particular buyers. The yards doesn't employ a neighborhood. The yards is the neighborhood. It does not ask permission, and it intends to stay that way, right up until the moment it cannot. The empire spreading outward from those gates in the 1880s and 1890s is built on a network that no competitor can replicate and no regulator has yet thought to challenge. Philip Armour, Gustavus Swift, and two other major packers, Nelson Morris and Edward Morris, become known collectively as the Beef Trust, and the name is accurate in every sense. Their branch house system plants refrigerated distribution rooms in every major American city: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Kansas City, St. Louis, San Francisco. The Armour label, red ink on white paper, 3-inch block letters applied by hand stamp to every crate, appears on loading docks from Maine to California. The Swift Premium Brand Guarantee Card, inserted into every crate at the Chicago end, tells the buyer what temperature the meat was held at and for how many days, and under whose inspection, a piece of paper that functions simultaneously as a quality promise and a market positioning weapon. Prices in Boston and Denver move in lockstep with no visible communication between the branch houses. A Kansas cattle rancher notices first, notices that no matter where he sells, the buying price follows the same curve, and no matter where the consumer buys, the selling price follows a different but equally synchronized curve. The gap between the two is always the same. The gap never narrows, it holds. The complaint reaches Congress. An investigation by the Bureau of Corporations in 1902 produces a report that, read carefully, describes in bureaucratic language something the rancher understood immediately from instinct. The machine was so efficient it looked exactly like a conspiracy, because it was. The investigation does not close the yards. Nothing closes the yards yet. But a different kind of enemy is already loading its weapon, and it arrives not from Washington, but from a 27-year-old journalist from New Jersey who spends 7 weeks in Packingtown in 1904 working undercover as a common laborer. Upton Sinclair enters the kill floors intending to write about the workers, about the wages, the injuries, the 12-hour shifts, the company towns, the racial hierarchy of the labor force. He documents all of it. He intends the book that will follow to ignite a labor movement. Instead, when The Jungle is published by Doubleday, Page and Company in February 1906, what the American reading public cannot stop talking about is not the workers. It is the meat, the passage about floor sweepings, the description of rat droppings in the sausage mixture, the grotesque accounting of what went into the cans labeled potted ham, the scooped floor residue, the condemned product rerouted, the casual disregard for what the consumer would never see. Theodore Roosevelt, who has his own reasons for wanting leverage over the packers, receives an advance copy, reads it in 2 days, and sends his own investigators, Charles Neal and James Reynolds, to the yards in the spring of 1906. The Neal-Reynolds report, filed in May, does not find everything Sinclair described. It finds enough. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act both pass in June 1906, and the yards must now pay for federal inspectors stationed permanently on its floors. The yard's own posted hygiene notices, which had existed before Sinclair arrived and been largely ignored, now become evidence of a gap between what management claimed and what management enforced. Sinclair had aimed for the heart and hit the stomach, and the stomach hit back harder than anything he planned, and the empire absorbed the blow and kept moving until the next enemy arrived from inside. The chain speed is set by management, not by the workers. This is the foundational fact of life on the kill floor, and every worker who enters the yards understands it within their first shift. The chain moves at whatever pace the supervisor decides, and supervisors have a system, documented in union complaint filings from the early 1900s, of incrementing the chain speed 2 or 3 notches per shift without announcement, watching the line accelerate almost imperceptibly until the pace at the end of the shift is measurably faster than the pace at the beginning, and the workers have kept up because they had no choice, and the next morning the faster pace is the new baseline. Michael Donnelly, president of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen of North America, leads a strike against this system and others in 1904, pulling thousands of workers off the kill floors in the middle of summer. The packers respond by recruiting black workers from the South, men who have been systematically excluded from the union halls and who need the work and who are not wrong to take it. but whose presence on the floor is used by management with deliberate precision to fracture the labor coalition along racial lines. The tactic works. The 1904 strike collapses. By 1919, the racial tensions that management cultivated inside the yards have spilled into the streets of Chicago in one of the deadliest race riots in American history, a 5-day explosion of violence in which 38 people are killed, and the yard's labor geography, black workers and white workers competing for the same jobs on floors where management controls the pace, is one of the pressures that detonates it. A second strike in 1921 fails as the first failed. Management doesn't break the strike. They break the solidarity and they call it labor relations, and for the moment it works, but the fracture is load-bearing, and load-bearing fractures have a way of reappearing at the worst possible time. The worst possible time for the Packers is 1920. The antitrust machinery that the Bureau of Corporations report in 1902 had started moving finally arrives at its destination. A federal consent decree, shaped in large part by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, that forces the major packers to divest their retail distribution arms. The branch house network, 800 refrigerated distribution points across the country, built over 4 decades of capital expenditure, the single greatest competitive innovation in the history of American food distribution, must be surrendered. Not reorganized, not restructured, surrendered. The Packers and Stockyards Act follows in 1921, and the regulatory architecture closes around the industry like a hand around a throat. The cold chain they had built was the evidence against them. The infrastructure that had made them untouchable had simultaneously made them visible, and visible at scale to a federal government that had just watched the progressive era teach it what monopoly looks like when it controls something people eat. The companies spend the next decade contracting. Competitors in Kansas City and Omaha, who had been held at distance by the branch house network, begin filling the gaps. The machine that had spent 40 years becoming invincible is ordered to dismantle itself, and it is told this is for the good of America, and there is no appeal. Strength had become the trap. 2 wars give the yards a reprieve that looks like salvation and functions like a delay. When the United States enters the First World War in 1917, federal procurement contracts flood in and the yards expands its operations to meet military demand, running longer shifts, moving more volume, functioning as a critical node in the military supply chain. When the Second World War arrives in 1941, the same expansion happens again, faster and larger. The kill floors run around the clock. Women move into kill floor support roles for the first time, learning the chain, working beside it with a speed that surprises the foreman who doubted them. Government inspection stamps are burned into every crate, and every crate moves toward a port, and the canned meat specifications, the dimensions and tin gauge and caloric content of the sea ration, are a direct downstream product of the yard's processing capacity. The production records shattered during the war years will not be broken again. Post-war, the yards and the companies that anchor it expect the boom to continue. The country is growing. Consumer demand is expanding. The infrastructure is in place. What they do not see clearly enough, or see and dismiss as someone else's problem in someone else's decade, is that the post-war economy is rebuilding itself around a new geography of food production. And that geography has no center. Iowa Beef Processors is incorporated in 1960. Its founders built their first plant in Denison, Iowa in 1961, not in a city but next to a feedlot in the flat agricultural interior where the cattle actually are rather than in the industrial hub where they have traditionally been shipped. The innovation is deceptively simple. Slaughter the animal at the feedlot, break the carcass into primal cuts on site, vacuum pack the cuts, and ship boxed beef in corrugated 60-pound stackable boxes directly to supermarket chains. The box itself, corrugated cardboard printed with routing codes stacked 12 high in a refrigerated trailer, replaces the hanging carcass on the overhead trolley hook that had defined the industry for 90 years. The supermarket chains, which by the 1950s have grown large enough to deal directly with suppliers and do not need the Chicago middleman, sign on immediately. IBP's labor costs run 40% below Chicago. The interstate highway system, completed in stages through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, means that refrigerated trucks can move product coast to coast without rail. The overhead trolley hook, which had reorganized a continent in 1875, is now just an artifact of a previous logistics era. Supermarkets bypass Chicago entirely. A USDA report on shifts in slaughter geography in 1965 shows the migration in statistical terms so clear that no one in the industry can pretend to misread them. Chicago's processing volume drops 30% in 8 years. Inside the yards, management calls IBP a feedlot operation, calls the shift a temporary regional trend, calls the new geography a phase that will correct itself when transportation costs fluctuate. The future doesn't come to Chicago. Chicago watches it drive past on Interstate 80. The panic decisions follow the pattern that dying industrial empires always follow. Spend money on the facility you're about to lose. In the early 1950s, a major fire, following an earlier blaze in 1934, destroys a significant section of the complex and is rebuilt at enormous cost, an investment that extends the facility's life but deepens the debt. The kill floor modernization programs of the late 1950s replace wooden infrastructure with stainless steel, install new ventilation systems, update refrigeration, spend millions of dollars making the Chicago facility more competitive at a moment when the competition has already moved to Iowa and Nebraska and is no longer playing by Chicago's rules. The new stainless steel gleams under the fluorescent lights with a precision the old wooden floors never had. It is also irrelevant. The last superintendent locks the facility not because the equipment fails, but because the economics have made the equipment beside the point. Armour and Company, which had anchored the yards since 1867, begins closing individual buildings through the late 1960s. Workers receive 30-day notices in batches, a few hundred at a time, and each round of notices produces a smaller yards that is less able to resist the next round of notices. The final cattle auction is held on July 30th, 1971. Attendance is thin, the prices are low. The buyers who would have filled the floor a decade earlier are already sourcing from IBP and Kansas City and have been for years. When the last animal is sold, the gates are locked and 106 years of continuous operation ends on a Tuesday afternoon in July. They had spent a fortune and a decade making the yards ready for a future that had already left. The machine that had never stopped, not for blizzards, not for strikes, not for 2 world wars, not for fire or flood or federal decree, stopped. At its peak, the yards had employed 17,500 people. The number at closure is 0. The overhead trolley hooks hang still for the first time in a century, and the silence of the kill floor, a floor that had never known silence in the living memory of anyone in Packingtown, arrives not dramatically but incrementally, building through the days after the gates close as the last machinery powers down and the last maintenance crews complete their rounds, and the building begins the slow conversion from facility to ruin to demolition permit. Workers collect their last tools from the lockers. The lockers are not picked up for months. Demolition takes most of it. The kill floors, the pens, the Transit House Hotel where cattle buyers and commission agents had eaten their steaks and signed their contracts for 90 years. All of it comes down through the early 1970s, the steel salvaged, the lumber burned or hauled, the foundation pads broken up and graded over. The stone gate at Exchange Avenue and Peoria Street survives by a single preservation vote, a near thing, the kind of decision that looks obvious in retrospect and was not obvious at all when it was made. It stands now in the middle of a light industrial park, 2 carved cattle heads above the limestone arch, the original 1879 ironwork still in place, the plaque on its face bearing dates and names that most people who drive past it have never read. The street grid of the industrial park follows the geometry of the old cattle pens exactly, because the streets were laid along the pen boundaries when the yards was built, and no one had a reason to change them when the pens came down. And so the shape of the organism persists in the pavement even though the organism is gone. Long-time residents of back of the yard say that on certain hot summer days, when the wind comes from the right direction and the sun has been on the pavement since morning, something surfaces from the soil, a trace of rendered fat absorbed over a century into the ground itself, patient and permanent, refusing the ordinary logic of decay. Visitors stop at the stone gate occasionally, read the plaque, look around at the warehouses and parking lots and cannot picture what stood here. They are standing in the ghost of a machine. A steer entered this gate and in 38 seconds became 22 crates. The gate is still standing. There are no steers, there is no chain. The geometry of the pens is still in the pavement. The machine is gone. The shape of it remains.